Welcome to Jagged Edge with Yogi Patel.
Purpose piece came out of the fact we have such an attendance problem and we have a student engagement problem. A lot of people are starting to say maybe it's not an engagement problem, it really is a purpose or relevancy problem. So when you think about how schools were initially formed, initially it was so that you could read, so that you could vote. And then it became the idea that school's purpose was content transmission, that people needed a basic set of skills and that we needed to have a liberal arts education where we would transmit a little bit of information to everybody because information wasn't accessible to everybody. So at that time, becoming what they called a Renaissance man at the time was really a way to get ahead in society. Then the internet came and information access became really available to anybody. So that purpose isn't really, it's not relevant anymore. However, the unfortunate thing is in education, we're still assessed on that purpose. So we have all these high stakes tests that are assessing content transmission. Then we moved to career readiness. And so we started building pathways and credentialing pathways. And with the current state of AI, I read somewhere that 60% of the jobs in 10 years we don't have right now. And so it's not even new jobs, it's all jobs. 60% we don't have. So if anybody's trying to tell you that they understand the pathway that they need to put somebody on to be successful, they're not telling the truth because nobody knows what that pathway is. And we're starting to see a lot of questions in higher ed and in K-12 to say, what is our purpose? What's the purpose of education? Are we going to even need a college degree in the future? Are we going to need credentials? What are we going to do to equip students for their future? So that's where I've been really talking to a lot of organizations of late to say, what is the purpose of school in a post-AI world? So thinking about what do people need? And what I would argue, and I think a lot of people agree, is that we need thinking skills. We need the part of our brain up here that makes us human. Because when we start to have a relationship in technology, we need to equip kids to fill the gap. There are going to be gaps that human thinking and the human brain can do better than AI. But if we're just teaching kids logarithmic or algorithmic things that say, hey, here you go through all these steps and you solve these math problems, or here's vocabulary, you need to know what these words mean, or here's just basic content. We're preparing them to compete with a machine that will always do it faster and better. So what we need to be doing is preparing kids for the things the machines can't do. And it's a massive shift. And I've even listened, and it's kind of scary. I've listened to some of the AI podcasts, and there are quite a few futurists that are saying schools won't exist in the next 10 years because if they don't become relevant, they are a huge expense. And so how do we justify that expense? And in reality, the time is now to really make some change.
Yes, so the changes are happening. And in school, we're holding on to some of the ideas because this is how we've always done it. So what are we afraid of letting go? That's one of the first questions we need to ask. And if we don't shift, what are the risks for the next generation in terms of learning?
Yeah. I think the first thing that we really have to shift is get away from the structures that make school, class periods and grade levels and subject areas. We need to start to think, is there a place for that? So maybe there is. Maybe there's a place where those things are retained to a certain degree. Start to think, then really what the teacher needs to be is the disruptor. I need to ask you really pointed questions. I need to push you to think. I need to push you to get uncomfortable with things and to resolve that discomfort. I need to teach you how to feel like you have agency and voice and that you have the capacity to create an argument and to fight for what you think is right or to be creative in different situations. And if you've been in a school recently, that is not the kind of teaching learning that's going on. So I think the second part of your question of really thinking, what does this mean for kids, is that they look at learning as completion and compliance. And there have been some national studies done where kids say that they learn outside of school, but they come to school to get credentialed. And we did that with the credentialing and it's grades, it's credits, it's certifications, it's all these other things. And they're not getting an opportunity to really do the experiential and authentic learning because I think the biggest mistake we ever made in education was connecting student test scores to teacher quality because the entire system shifted from I teach kids to I teach content. And you hear teachers say things like, well, I don't have time to remediate because I got to get through this. Well, if the purpose is learning, you have to remediate, right? Because you haven't met your purpose yet. If the purpose is about you getting data score and you just want to get through the curriculum, then so you can see it all the time in schools. So I think there's a lot of shifts that have to happen, because at the end of the day, if they don't, kids aren't going to come to school. Public schools are going to lose more and more kids to the graduation mills, where they can just get on and work their way through a curriculum and get bare bones of depth of knowledge around that curriculum and get a diploma and get out.
Lisa, you're speaking so much about executive functions, the importance of executive functions. And currently, we are not doing as well of a job because we have systems in place, the grades that you're speaking about. Adele Diamond, she's a researcher from Canada, and she has amazing studies about executive functions, not just in early childhood, but how that plays a role as we age. And you spoke just now.
Where we finally connected the way we teach reading to the way our brain learns reading. And that's not new. That's been around for decades, right? We have the same information about behavior and our brain science, how our executive functions are impacted by stress, how we develop executive functions, the impact technology is having as we continue to cognitively offload the executive function responsibilities to our devices. And teachers don't get any of it, or they just get a little snippet of it. So one of the things I think we need to do is embed the brain science into every course, not have a brain science course, but to say, this is a lesson planning course. So let's embed the brain science around learning and how relevancy and experience impacts retention and learning. And so how are you building that into the way you're designing your instruction? And that it's not happening right now. And it's not happening at the leadership level either, which is, as you opened today and you said, we are never short on ideas. We're short on reform, right? And so I've got two books that kind of really get at this. One's called NeuroWell, which is really about the changes we want to see in schools to create a culture that is aligned with the brain science and practices and routines. The other is Aspirations to Operations, and that's the leadership book. And it's really about exactly what you were talking about, is we have all these great ideas, but we don't implement them with fidelity and we don't get sustainable change. We just chew around the edges. And I think right now we are in this super communication and empathy and community. But the problem is we don't then put the same level of strategy to actually developing those K to 12. And critical thinking is one of them. Everybody complains about it. So I asked a high school staff about a month ago, I said, okay, our task today, we had a 2-hour workshop. I said, we're going to define critical thinking and we're going to create a measure so we can gauge whether or not students are doing it. Because if we don't measure it, it doesn't matter, right? So we just talk about it. And that's where we get a lot of buzzwords and lip service to things. So in 2 hours, they struggled to come up with a common definition. So I think part of the problem with the systems change is just this love of word salad. Educators will fight for months on one word or this or that. And can we get past the word salad and really get at the meat of things? And so we finally got to a definition that people could get around. And I said, you might not every word on it, but is this conceptually what you mean by critical thinking? And they said, yes. And I said, okay, build a rubric. And so we started to build the rubric. And what was interesting is they had just had a session on how to use AI. But the AI training that I see in schools is how do we prevent AI from being a tool for cheating for students? Not truly how do we rethink the way that we teach and learn, knowing that AI is always here. It's like when the calculator came and people are like, they have to do it in their head because they're never going to have a calculator in their pocket 24 hours a day. Now we have them in our pocket, on our wrists, everywhere, right? So it's the same thing with AI. It's not going to go away. So how are we fundamentally changing what we're doing? So anyway, some of the teachers went to AI and pulled up rubrics. So I had them broken into groups, and I said, okay, make a copy of each one. And we looked at the 5 different rubrics that they had produced. And some of them were horrible and some of them had elements. And so we started to talk about AI can help you like get your ideas on paper, but it's only as good as the prompts that you put in. And so we started to iterate on that and saying, how can we use AI as a tool to help us actually define the creative thinking or critical thinking? And then the next thing I had them do, which was hilarious, is I said, okay, so think of what your next assignment is or your next unit and type into Chat or Claude or whatever you use. How can I assess the following standards in this unit? Here's the book I'm using, the tool, the curriculum, whatever. How can I create an assessment that is AI proof? And what was so funny was the AI came back and said, that is a great question and one that all educators should be asking right now. And so then it gave us ideas on how to assess the students. And guess what? It was about connecting the personal side, the human side of the student to the content, because AI doesn't know the student. And so I'm hopeful, as much as I'm a little scared because it's a time of real change, it's also a time of real hope where we might be able to steer the boat to turn it back toward humans, toward the people in the system versus just the test statistics that we can get out of them.
Lisa, let's stick a little bit longer with this critical thinking part of executive function. What are the biggest misconceptions?
So I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that people are capable of doing critical thinking when they're in duress. And so, one of the things that I talk a lot to school leaders about, and I talk to teachers about with students, is that from the leader to the teacher level, think about how change in general, any kind of change you're doing, threatens the identity of a teacher. So, we talked about some of the big shifts we need to make is the role of a teacher. If I've been an expert for 20 years in my department, maybe I'm a department chair, or I've been doing this for a long time and I'm considered a good teacher. Now